Late 17th century, the Kingdom of Sweden dominates the Baltic Sea, as most of the Baltic coast is under its control. Of course, the neighbors of the Swedish kingdom did not like the current situation, namely the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Denmark and the Tsardom of Russia, but the Swedish army, which during the period under review was considered the most combat-ready in Europe, forced the neighbors of the Swedish kingdom to avoid open military confrontation. The situation changed in 1697. After the death of the Swedish king Charles XI, the throne is occupied by his 15-year-old son under the name Charles XII. Having decided that a teenager on the throne simply would not be able to effectively command the army, the neighbors of the Swedish kingdom began preparing for war, planning to return the territories previously captured by Sweden. Thus, the Elector of Saxony and concurrently the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth Augustus II planned to establish control over Livonia, and the King of Denmark and Norway Frederick IV planned to return the provinces on the Scandinavian peninsula, the loss of which did not allow the collection of duties for the passage of ships through the Sound Strait. Also, a confrontation developed between Denmark and Sweden for influence over the Duchy of Schleswig-Holstein. To increase their chances of victory, they attracted the Tsardom of Russia into their alliance, whose ruler, Peter I, who had yet to receive the nickname the Great, was not against gaining access to the Baltic Sea by returning Ingria, which previously belonged to the Tsardom of Russia. The problem was that the Russian kingdom was at war with the Ottoman Empire, so Peter I promised to declare war on Sweden as soon as peace was concluded with the Ottoman Empire. On February 11, 1700, the Saxon army invaded Sweden and began the siege of Riga. Despite his grandiose plans, Augustus II was very poorly prepared for the siege of the fortified city, since his army had practically no siege artillery. Due to the impossibility of taking the city by storm, Augustus II planned to take possession of Riga, depriving its garrison of supplies and thereby forcing it to capitulate. In March 1700, the Danish army invaded Holstein, planning first to dispossess Sweden of its possessions in mainland Europe. Very soon, the Danish army besieged the city of Tunning, but it was at this time that Charles XII was able to prove to everyone that his military talent was clearly underestimated. On July 24, 1700, the Swedish army, supported by the Anglo-Dutch squadron, landed 10 kilometers north of the capital of the Danish kingdom, the city of Copenhagen. The 15,000-strong Swedish army was opposed only by the 4,000-strong garrison of Copenhagen, which was completely unprepared for defense. In this situation, already on August 7, Denmark was forced to conclude a peace treaty on Swedish terms, obliging it to pay indemnity to Sweden and abandon the alliance with Saxony. On August 19, not knowing that Denmark had already withdrawn from the war, the Tsardom of Russia declared war on the Swedish kingdom. Already on August 24, the Russian army set out on a campaign planning to establish control over the main fortress of Ingria, Narva. The siege of Narva began on October 14. Despite the fact that Peter the Great planned to use 60,000 soldiers for the siege of Narva, by the time the siege work began in the vicinity of the city, only 34,000 to 40,000 soldiers were able to be collected. Due to the fact that the Russian army had only light guns at its disposal, shelling of city fortifications was ineffective. 2 weeks later the ammunition ran out. Since Narva and neighboring Ivangorod were essentially a double fortress, Peter I had to greatly stretch his army to encircle them. Meanwhile, Augustus II received news that Denmark had withdrawn from the war, which is why on September 8 he ordered his army to end the siege of Riga and leave Swedish territory. Thanks to the retreat of the Saxon army, Charles XII was able to transfer part of his army by sea to Pernav. The Swedish army arrived in Pernav on October 6, after which Charles XII decided to give his soldiers a rest before moving against the Russian troops invading Ingria. On November 18, in order to hasten the arrival of additional forces and the delivery of ammunition for the siege of Narva, Peter I left his army and went to Novgorod, leaving the Saxon Field Marshal Duke de Croix to command the siege. The very next day, November 19, the Swedish army under the command of Charles XII reached the outskirts of Narva. The Russian army was stationed around Narva and Ivangorod on both banks of the river. On the left bank of the river, the positions of the Russian army were protected by a double earthen rampart, the edges of which abutted the river. The right flank, consisting of 14,000 soldiers, was commanded by Golovin. In the center was the division of Prince Trubetskoy with 6,000 soldiers, on the left flank was the division of General Wyde with 3,000 soldiers. 5,000 horsemen under the command of Sheremetev were stationed between the Wyde division and the river bank. The Russian army had at its disposal 22 cannons and 17 mortars, which were placed along the ramparts. November 19 at 10 o'clock in the morning, the Swedish army of about 10.5 thousand soldiers reached the positions of the Russian troops. The Swedes lined up in two lines. On the right flank, in the first line, there was General Vellink's infantry, and in the second, Wachtmeister's cavalry. In the center in the first line were the detachments of Major General Posse, and in the second the detachments of Major General Maydel. On the left flank in the first line were the detachments of Renschild and Horn, behind which the cavalry reserve was located. Charles XII positioned himself behind the center of his army. Knowing full well that the extended positions of the Russian army were poorly suited for defense, Sheremetev proposed to withdraw most of the army into the field to give a general battle, but the Duke of Croy rejected this application, saying that the Russian army would not be able to resist the Swedes in an open field. Thus, the Russian army was inactive, and the initiative completely passed into the hands of the Swedes. Charles XII knew very well the size and location of the Russian army, so he abandoned the idea of attacking the enemy's center, which was more fortified, and decided to attack the flanks in order to throw the Russian army into the river. Arranging their infantry in two columns, under the command of Renschild and Vellink, the Swedes prepared for the attack. In front of each column were 500 grenadiers with fashion, who were supposed to fill up the ditch at the site of the attack. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon the battle began. Thanks to the heavy snowfall, as well as the fact that the wind and snow blew in the face of the Russian army, the Swedes managed to approach the Russian positions almost unnoticed. The Swedish grenadiers filled the ditch with fascines and began to climb the rampart. Very soon a bloody hand-to-hand fight began, which, however, lasted only half an hour, after which the Swedes broke into the Russian camp. Due to the snowstorm, visibility was no more than 20 meters, so the appearance of the Swedes in the Russian camp caused real panic, which was aggravated by cries of the Germans are traitors. The Russian soldiers thought that they had been betrayed by foreign officers, so they immediately rushed to beat them. The panic was aggravated by the onslaught of Swedish troops, who acted harmoniously as a single mechanism. In this situation, the Russian right flank tried to retreat along a pontoon bridge located near the island of Kamperholm, but under the weight of a large number of people it broke. Realizing that battles were already taking place in the Russian camp itself and that in conditions of poor visibility the cavalry would only die, Sheremetev ordered his cavalry to retreat. At this time, the Duke of de Croy and other foreign officers, fearing beating by their own soldiers, surrendered to the Swedes. In other matters, not the entire Russian army fled. On the right flank, the Semenovsky and Lefortovo regiments, together with soldiers from Golovin's division, took up defensive positions, fencing themselves with slingshots and carts. Wyde's division on the left flank did the same. The Swedes' attacks were broken over and over again against the Russian defenses on the left and right flanks. The arrival of the king, although it inspired the soldiers, did not change the situation in any way. The bloody battle continued and subsided only after dark. At night, part of the Swedish infantry, having plundered the Russian camp, got drunk, as a result of which two Swedish battalions began to shoot at each other in the dark. However, the position of the Russian army was difficult. Due to the lack of communication between the right and left flanks, they could not act together or safely leave the battlefield. In this situation, the Russian army was forced to begin negotiations on surrender under the terms of which the Russian army, along with banners and weapons, was able to cross to the right bank, leaving artillery and convoys to the enemy. On the night, Swedish and Russian sappers jointly restored the crossing, after which the Russian army left the Swedish bank of the river. Nevertheless, the Swedes violated the terms of surrender, leaving 700 people captured, including 10 generals and 10 colonels. The defeat at Narva forced Peter I to hastily reform his army, while reducing the number of foreign officers in the troops. Some historians claim that after the defeat at Narva, Peter was the first to try to make peace with Charles XII. How it was actually unknown. Maybe after the victory over the Russian army, Charles XII believed that the Tsardom of Russia would not be able to continue the war, and therefore it would be possible to tear away new territories from it, or Peter the Great simply did not offer the Swedes to make peace, but a peace treaty was not concluded one way or another. While Peter I hastily reformed his army, Charles XII, deciding that the Russians no longer posed a threat to him, concentrated his efforts on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It should be mentioned that Augustus II besieged Riga as the Elector of Saxony, without the support of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth army, so Charles XII had no official reason for invading the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. However, when you have a powerful army under your command that has already won many victories, you don't need a special reason. Having accused the Polish and Lithuanian gentry of allowing the Saxon army through their territory, Charles XII began preparations for an invasion of the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In turn, Augustus gathered a 9,000-strong Saxon army on the banks of the western Dvina River, which was joined by a 4,000-strong army of the Tsardom of Russia, planning to allow the Swedes to invade the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Despite the fact that Charles XII had only 7,000 soldiers at his disposal, on July 8 he ordered a crossing of the river. In the battle that broke out, luck was on the side of the Swedish army, which was more disciplined and better trained, so it was not possible to prevent the Swedes from crossing and the Allied armies were forced to retreat. By the end of 1701, the Swedes managed to establish control over almost all of Courland and Charles XII began preparing for his Polish campaign. Meanwhile, in the north, things were not so rosy for the Swedes. At the end of 1701, the Russian army invaded Ingria and on December 29, the Russian army under the command of Sheremetev managed to develop the Swedish army commanded by Schlippenbach, 7 kilometers from Dorpat, after which the Swedish army in the north had to go on the defensive. In 1702, the Swedish army moved through the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth without encountering much resistance, since most of the local gentry went over to its side without a fight. Only the Krakow and Sandomierz voivodeships remained loyal to Augustus II. In the summer, Charles XII, who managed to occupy Warsaw, began moving towards the city of Krakow. On July 8, 1702, near the village of Klisow, Charles XII inflicted a crushing defeat on Augustus II, forcing him to hastily retreat to Sandomierz, thanks to which the Swedes occupied Krakow without a fight. Meanwhile, in the north, the situation was not in favor of Charles XII. On October 11, as a result of a swift assault, the Russian army occupied the Noteburg fortress located at the source of the Neva. Since the advance of the Russian army in the north was rather slow, Charles XII focused on the war against Augustus II, deciding that he could defeat the Russians and return all the territories they occupied after the victory over Saxony. This fact played into the hands of the Tsardom of Russia, whose army was able to establish control over almost the entire Ingria by the end of 1703. In addition, at the mouth of the Neva, Peter I ordered the foundation of a new city, St. Petersburg, which was destined for the role of window to Europe. Meanwhile, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, on February 16, 1704, the Warsaw Confederation was formed, which deposed King Augustus II. On July 12, 1704, Poznan voivode Stanislaw Leszczyński, who was a protégé of Charles XII, became the new ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Swedish king's joy from victories in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was overshadowed only by the situation in the north, since by the beginning of August Russian troops managed to occupy Dorpat and Narva. However, even in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the position of the Swedes was not stable, since there were still supporters of Augustus II in Poland, who formed the Sandomierz Confederation and on August 19, 1704, turning to the Tsardom of Russia for help, they signed the Treaty of Narva, under the terms of which Poland entered the war against Sweden, and the Russian army received the right to operate on the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Nevertheless, the arrival of the Russian corps in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth could not radically change the course of the war. Nevertheless, the Swedes also failed to crush the enemy armies and end the war, so in the fall of 1706, Charles XII, at the head of his army, invaded Saxony and began moving towards Dresden. Since the defense of Saxony was provided only by a small army, the Saxon Privy Council, which, in the absence of Augustus II, ruled the country, was forced to sign a peace treaty, which obliged Augustus II to recognize Stanislaw Leszczyński as the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and cease hostilities. He also had to break the military alliance with the Tsardom of Russia. Despite the fact that Augustus II received news that a peace treaty had been signed on his behalf, he did not risk announcing this to the Russians, since a 10,000-strong Russian corps under the command of Menshikov was located with him. In turn, Menshikov, knowing that Charles XII and his main forces were in Saxony, decided to defeat the Swedish troops in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Swedish army under the command of Martefeld and the army of Stanislaw Leszczyński were located near the city of Kalish. Augustus II warned the Swedes that they would soon be attacked and recommended that they retreat, but the Swedes decided that this was a military trick and made a huge mistake. On October 18, they were attacked by a Russian corps, which was supported by the armies of Saxony and the Sandomier's Confederation. In the ensuing battle, the armies of Sweden and Stanislaw Leszczyński were defeated, thanks to which the Swedes lost control of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Finding himself in a difficult situation, Charles XII published a secret peace treaty signed by the Saxons and forced Augustus II to fulfill it under the threat of losing Saxony. Having learned about the betrayal of the Saxons, the Russian corps remained for the winter in Galicia, and Augustus II was forced to return to Saxony. Thus, Charles XII had only one opponent left in the person of the Russian Tsar, but he did not yet realize that since the Battle of Narva, the Russian army had become many times stronger, having decided that the defeat at Kalish was just an accident. The Northern War was still far from over and the bloodiest battles awaited the opposing armies ahead. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.